All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon. This is Chris Glass coming to you from Atlanta with Improving. I've been with Improving for 6 years now. I'm currently a director. I've been working with Angular for several years. I started off with Angular JS, and I've come up through to the latest, which the latest is Angular 10. So with that, we will begin our presentation for today. So I will be showing you several links. There's no need for you to worry about trying to write those links down. Once the presentation is over, we will be recording this and posting it to our YouTube channel. So this is the only link that you will need, is the YouTube user / Improving Enterprises. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover 3 areas about Angular. What is it, the tools that are available, and the features for it. To just set the tone for the format, basically I will pause after every slide for any questions that the audience may have. I do encourage everybody to ask questions. We've all been there. Somebody I'm sure has never done Angular, and then there's somebody that's done a lot of Angular. I feel that basically all questions are difficult, regardless of whether you're experienced or newbie. It's just a matter of what your skill level is, and so we're here to try to answer any questions that you may have. So what is Angular? At the core, it's really nothing more than any other website. It's just a HTML, JavaScript, and from both of those things, we produce some static files. The reason I point this out is when you start messing with it, a lot of people are intimidated by it, but ultimately, it's just the same thing that you've done. If you've done any type of website development, you've probably dealt with this technology before, just in a different format. But ultimately, it produces static files. The reason I point out the static files is for 2 reasons. One is once you have the static files, you can host that on AWS S3 or Azure Storage. And it's important to recognize that, because it's not like a MVC app where you're hitting the server and the server is rendering the pages for you. Now, you can have Angular do some of that, but most sites are basically static sites. So here's all those links I was telling you about. I've got 2 pages for them. I will actually go to each one of these just for a second, just to give a brief overview of each one of these. Angular itself is a big topic. I did a deep dive on it over a 2-month period for about an hour at a time per week, so about 8 hours. So we're going to cram a lot of information into today. I'm going to try to keep most everything at a high level and simple to get the points across. But again, I do encourage you to ask any questions at that point in time. So the main source for your documentation is Angular.io. So just hopping over there for a brief minute. If you go to docs, the biggest thing that you're going to be interested in to get started is the CLI. So you can download Angular from npm and load up Node and get started. But once you have it, then you have to start creating an application. And everything you do through Angular is basically started through the CLI. So you would definitely want to come to this site and review this information. Just real quick, the first thing that you're going to need to know is ng-new. So ng-new, you will give it your application's name, and it will actually prompt you for some other values, and it will kick off and give you a template for you to begin with. One of the biggest things I want to talk about there on the ng-new though is there's an option for a prefix. The prefix is important. The reason it's important is you may be using other people's components and so forth. So the prefix is basically kind of like think of it kind of like a namespace for your markup code, and it just enables you to have your own namespace so that you can have your components and they won't interfere with other people's components. Moving on, there's Angular material as well. So the thing I want to point out about Angular material is it is done by the actual Angular team, and this is important because they are building it with Angular, and in addition to that, most everything you need to create a website can be done completely from just using tools out of the box from Angular. So this is the Angular material site. There's a couple of things to note here. One is you can create a theme for your site. So everybody's used to theming skins and so forth for your site. Typically, most people are used to, when they get started with material, you think that you can only really have one theme, but it does actually support multiple themes. There is a theme generator. I do have a link on there as well. The theme generator is nothing more than you can pick different shades from a color palette and then produce a theme name, and then you can just reference that theme using those names throughout the application. But the biggest thing that material itself gives you is basically it's the equivalent of something similar to Bootstrap, if you're familiar with Bootstrap. It's basically your front end elements that makes your website nice and pretty and dynamic. I won't go through everything that's over here, but basically, again, every component that is here is can be used right out of the box and has animations and so forth built into it. The other piece I want to point out is this Angular Flex layout. The Flex layout will basically, if you're familiar with CSS and Flexbox, it gives you the ability to control how you're laying out your elements on the screen. I won't go into details here either, but just to kind of point out, here's again, the link is will be on the site, but here's a site that you can come to and play with to see how, by just changing certain attributes, the elements will be laid out differently. The reason I'm pointing this out has nothing to do with Flex itself. Again, it's Angular Flex box, and because of that, you can actually just go into the code and through directives on your elements lay them out so it's declarative inside of the HTML markup. And so just as a quick overview, like you can see that these elements are laid out in a row, but if I flip to column, then they dynamically change to this. The other piece that is interesting to know about all this is becomes very useful when you're doing a mobile app, because it will allow you to switch responsively between a small screen and a big screen and change the layout for that. So for example, maybe I'm on a mobile device right now and it's laid out vertically, but then when I switch to a big screen, it lays it out horizontally. Again, it's just doing that dynamically based off of the screen resolution. All right. These last things that are this information about Angular itself. Basically, all of your coding will be done with TypeScript. TypeScript is a very good scripting language. It is much better, in my opinion, than JavaScript because it does provide that typing and it allows you to find errors with your code as you're actually typing it versus at runtime. RxJS is another tool that Angular is built on top of. It's basically a mechanism to create streams, and think of a stream as nothing more than something that's changing over time. So whatever that could be. So, I mean, a stream could be, hey, I'm gonna connect to the server and request some information, and so that information is changing over time. StackBlitz is another site that I enjoy because you can basically go there, and we will go there today for me to demo some stuff to you. But StackBlitz is a site that you can create different types of apps. One application type is an Angular app, and I will demonstrate that to you later. So jumping in with Angular, there's two types of things that you get out of the box. There's two types of tests. NG test, which is basically just unit tests where you're testing individual components to validate that they're working independently, correct? And then there's an end-to-end testing that you can run. Both of these you run with these commands. So NG is the CLI for Angular, and then the command that goes with that. So to run the unit test, you would do ng test. The end-to-end, you would do ng end-to-end. So I'm going to demonstrate that real quick because it is important. So I already have it up and running. And all right, so here's my site that I've got running locally on 4200, and here's my unit test that I have running. So in Visual Studio Code on node 1, I've just told it ng serve, which is what's serving up this site here for me. Over here in a second terminal, I did ng test, which basically kicked off this browser. The important thing to recognize here are these are meant to be ran in parallel. So as you start making changes to your website, it will just run your unit test and alert you to errors as they actually happen. So for example, that you can see here are the 3 tests that came with this sample. And one of them is, it says, should have as title all, should render title in H1 tag. So if we just look here, you can see that the title is inside of an H1 tag. If I change this to H2, oops. So you can see that this changed a little bit. This is running, and now you see, oh, I got one failure. What did it fail on? It says it cannot read this property, and oh, this is the test that it failed. Should render title in H1 tag. So if your specification said that, you can see that, oh, I messed it up. Let me go back and fix that. The other option would be to change the tag because the specification changed. So with that, I want to pause and just see if there's any questions so far.
No questions so far.
All right, great. All right, so now we're going to jump into the a more interesting. We'll start looking at some actual code, and as I said before, we will demonstrate this using StackFlix. So one of the major components of Angular is having individual components. These components can have many different options, and these are some of the things that you will see and use. So the whole presentation is about the things that you're most likely to run into. So a component can have inputs and outputs. Think of inputs as properties or values that you're sending into the component. Think of outputs as events, not as if you were tying one component to another component just by taking a property off of the first component and sending it to a property of the second component. That would still be an input on the second component. An output is an event only, so think of that as the equivalent of a click on a button. So with data binding, there is two-way data binding. You can pick which piece you want to use. The terminology is banana in a box, and if you look at it, it is a square brace followed by a parenthesis. And I'd like to tell people the way to memorize which one's which is typically input output. So input comes first, so the square brace comes first. output comes second, and so the parenthesis is inside of the box. And so the square piece is the box, and the banana are the parentheses. The other piece that people need to know about is these update strategies. I put a link here. We won't go into this today, but if you look at this link, it will show you the different types of strategies. The piece to know is out of the box, Angular is basically has a change detection cycle that's constantly running in the background. It will basically run through the entire tree to see if there's any changes and update dynamically. For a small site, this is no issue. It can actually run thousands of change detections per second. But as the site gets bigger and bigger, then it becomes an issue. And for that, to address that, there is a change detection strategy that is basically called on push. The difference being is if you set the change detection strategy on the component to on push, it will only update if a value is updated itself for that component. It will not update otherwise. And the last piece that I want to talk about is templates. So templates, so components are overused from when you first start off with Angular. You typically generate a lot of components because you think that that's the right thing to do. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Think of a component as you should only be creating it for reuse. So think of it like a page. So a page, you do end up having to create a component for a page, but a page may have a lot of stuff on it. But most likely you're not going to reuse that page anywhere else in your site. So it's like, why did I create this component? I'm not really getting any reuse for that. And the reason I'm pointing that out is even though you don't get reuse, you may end up having things repeated on a page. And so templates become a good thing to get familiar with so that you can reuse the template within that component, and because that's the only component that is actually using that. When the components start getting more complicated and you see that it is being shared amongst multiple components, that's when you should break that template out into a separate component. So I will pause. I'm about to show some code, but before I do that, I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions about any of this information.
Nothing yet.
All right. So let me. So this is StackBlitz, and this URL will be in the slides, so you'll be able to get to this later. But basically, I've got two StackBlitzes for two different pieces. This one, you can see that it says hello, improving lunch and learn. So let's look into this a little bit and look to some of those topics that we just covered. So if I look at the markup, I can see I've got a hello component and I have a name attribute and I'm passing it in this name value. And so this is actually how this got improving lunch and learn is from here. So this name is an attribute on this hello component, and it's getting the value from the app component itself. So if I look at the app component and look at the TypeScript, there is a name here. And so if I take off Angular and hit save, you will see that it updated. And again, you can see that I changed the TypeScript to make the modification, not the markup. So that's just demonstrating, hey, here's a component and how to use that component. So if you wanted to look at the details on that component, again, each component would have typically several files associated with it, but you do have options. So here's a hello component. This hello component actually chose to have an inline style, you can or inline template, and you can generate it so that your template is external. And that's how this app component is. So if you look at the TypeScript here, you can see that the template URL is referring to the file called app component HTML versus the hello, it's inline. So here I've got an input, and if you recall, I said, hey, it's input coming, information coming from one component to another component, and then I also have this output. So this output is I've created a custom event, and it basically just emits a number each time that I click on this. But if you look, so I'm gonna click on it and nothing is happening. And that's just because there's nothing currently listening to that. So if I just go and add a little bit of code to this, and I'll explain this code here in just 1 second. Those are the two pieces that I want to add. So here, remember I talked about banana in the box. This is the banana part. Again, it's the output. It's the output of this hello component that this app component is going to listen to. And when that happens, it's going to call the set lap count, and it'll get the number coming from the hello component. And if you look at the code behind, there's a function called set lap count, and again, it's just setting it to the value that's being sent to it. So if I sit here and click, you can see now it's dynamically updating that lap count. Again, that's all based off of that output event. Are there any questions about inputs and outputs?
Nope.
Okay, so again, this is Stack Blitz. Just want to point out real quick, if you right click in Stack Blitz, you don't have the ability to actually run CLI commands directly like you would from a terminal on your PC. So Stack Blitz has added in a menu so that you can generate most things that for Angular, not all things, but most things. So last night I did do some of this, and I have some code that I'll be just plopping in here, but ultimately I got all of it by right clicking here and generating stuff using Stack Blitz. So the other piece I want to talk about is, so there's a package JSON file, and you've got dependencies down here. And so down here, last night, I went ahead and added in Flex Layout and Angular Material. So I'm going to switch over to that real quick and start showing some information there. So back over here, in addition to components, there's directives. Directives, there's two types, structural and attributes. A structural directive is something that will basically change the HTML structure itself. So the examples that I have there for you are ngIf, ngFor, and ngSwitch. ngIf is the preferred mechanism versus hiding and showing things. It's actually adding and removing from the DOM itself. This is more efficient. If it's something super simple, you think, oh, it's not a big deal, I can just hide it. But what if it was something that was super complicated? It takes the load off of Angular, so it's best to use ngIf than showing and hiding. ngFor is just the equivalent of a for loop, so you can loop through something and do something over those items. And ngSwitch is like a switch statement, and that would be useful for, hey, I want to show this piece based off of this setting versus this other piece off of another setting. An attribute directive, think of that as an extension to a component. So think of it like you're extending you're doing a subclass of a class. So that, hey, somebody built something. So let's say I had an automobile class, and now I want to create a subclass for trucks and cars. So maybe I create a directive that allows me to put that attribute on it. And then that I can still have the automobile component, but then with that attribute, with the car attribute, it would behave slightly different than the truck attribute. So let me again switch back over to StackBlitz and show you some of that. All right, so we talked about ngIf. So here's the markup for it. And you can see I've got if true, do this stuff here. So the fact that I got this stuff here, it says control value and component value. So I should be seeing this on the screen. And over here, you do see control value and component value. So if I just flip this to false, those should no longer be there. And they are no longer there. So what about this else piece? So this works just like an if-else statement. And this goes back to the template pieces. So basically the else says, hey, if this whatever condition over here is false, I want to, you don't have to have the else, it's optional, just like in programming, but the else piece would be, hey, use this other template if this condition is false. So I've set this to false, so it's looking for a template called false template, and here is that template. And so you can see, how did it get that name? I just have this reference variable called false template. And so that's how it knew to come down here and stick this information on the screen now versus the information that was up here. So inside of this template here, we also have the demonstration for ng4. You can see that it's basically just a looping over teams. You can, and for those teams, it's going to show their team name. This information here is just hard-coded as an array over in our TypeScript. So here's the teams with all their names and their colors. So switching back here. So again, if we just look here, again, the first team is Ferrari. So it says Ferrari, Mercedes, and so forth. So I talked about, we talked about the attributes. So let's come back over here, and here is an attribute directive. So I didn't want to change how, first of all, this isn't even a component, it's just a markup, HTML in itself, but I didn't want to change how this element actually was behaving. So I wanted to extend the functionality of a div. And so what I did is created a directive called app highlight, and I passed in a color to say, hey, when I put my mouse over this item, show it in the color of the team. So Ferrari's color is red and Mercedes is green. So as I move through, it does that for each one. So are there any questions at this point?
I do have one question.
Okay.
It says, I thought I heard the suggestion to use a template rather than a component to declare a page. And if so, can you expand on that idea and or provide an example of its implementation?
Yeah, so that was not the intent. So I did speak about a page. You would create a component for a page where you, so this, let's look at just this section of code right here. As a new person coming in and creating my first Angular app, I might choose to make this little section right here a component. And there's nothing wrong with that, other than you might create a ton of components. So if this little section is never going to be reused other than in this markup page here, then I don't need to go and create a component for it. I can just create a template. And by creating that template, I can reuse it. So to reuse it, so like if I wanted to get another one here, all I'd have to do is do ng container. And so now if I put a break in here, you'll see that it shows up twice. So there you go. So this is what I was saying about reusing. You can create a template and then you can reuse this template multiple times within this markup, which again, if it's not being reused, there's no reason to go and create a component for it. That was the only intent there. Was that the only question?
Yeah, that's all we have so far.
Okay, so the last piece that we talked about was a switch statement, which I also have right here. So you can see I've got an ng switch. It's based off of this variable called best racing, and depending on, so here's the case statements for it. So if it's set to Formula 1, it should show Formula 1 is the premier car racing series, whereas if it was MotoGP, it would say it's the fastest motorcycles on the track. Again, it's just getting that from over here. So if I change this to MotoGP, it changed the output here based off of this variable. So again, that's just some of the options that you have to do with that. All right. So a big thing for websites are forms. So Angular has something specific for that, and Material does as well. These specific things here, the ng form, ng control, is specific to Angular. Material just has some additional nice features that you can use around it. So ng form, one thing that I want to point out is it does have a is submitted. And so the reason that you might want to use that is, say you have a submit button and you want it to only be submitted one time versus a user sitting there clicking and submitting it multiple times. You could put a disabled attribute on there and toggle the disabled based off of it being submitted. Then also you can reset that form with a state, meaning you can reset, if you don't give it a state, all the values would be cleared out. So you could start over, which would be good if you're like in a kiosk mode. But let's say you wanted to repopulate it with some other values, you would just pass that state and it would initialize those controls. Each control has some properties on it as well that are very useful for form development. There's a is valid, is invalid, is pristine and touched, and also has errors. So with that said, I'm going to switch back over to the Stack Blitz. And here's a form. So if we look real quick over here, it's a super simple form. There's the entire form. I just have one control in here and I got one button. So like I said, I put that this field was required. So if I empty this field out, it does two things. My button becomes disabled, and then it also gives me an error message over here. The error message is not something coming directly from Angular itself, it's so Material. So Material has a component called mat error, and you can sit here and monitor the errors. This has error is, so you could have several types of validators, and so each validator would have a name, and you can check to see if it has that type of error, and based off of that type of error, displaying an appropriate value for it. So for example, this says it's required, but let's also say that it couldn't exceed, let's say it was a number and you couldn't exceed 100. You could put an error message saying the value has to be less than 100 if they went over 100. But the other piece that's important to note here is, again, just like we had down here, we had this template and we gave it a name. This hashtag is a reference variable that then you can use this variable inside of this markup, just like it was any other variable. So again, when you see this hashtag, that becomes a reference variable for this template. And what is it referencing? It's referencing the ng model ng model ends up being a different attribute directive on here. So this is just basically giving me a reference to this, and by then I can use this variable to determine whether to show this error or not. The other piece that I can show here, again, just highlighting the reference variable one more time, is I named this form. It could have been anything, but the hashtag, again, is declaring a reference variable for this markup that I can then, again, reuse through the code. And where I ended up using it was right here on this button. I disabled it if the form became invalid for any reason. And because this was required, it was no longer valid. So if I start typing here, you can see it now becomes valid, and I can now submit it. All right. Any questions?
Nope.
All right. So one thing real quick. So if I type here real quick, I want to make this true because I want these values to show back up. So let's talk about this control value and component value. So they both say Ferrari, but what happens if I start changing it? Oh, they're both changing. Well, why are they both changing? It's because I have, again, the banana and the box. So it's basically updating the value in both directions no matter what I do. So what if I just did that? Well, that becomes just input. So now if I start changing, oh, the control value is changing. We can tell that because I'm typing in the control, right? But the component value is not being modified. So again, I'm just pointing out what that banana in the box syntax is and why you may or may not want to use it. All right. The other pieces on forms are there are two types of forms. There's reactive forms and template-driven forms. The reactive forms basically are immutable. This would be if you've done React using Redux, this would kind of follows that model more. And then template-driven is more based off of ng model with two-way data binding, so it does become mutable. The other piece I want to point out is there's there are validators. There's some built-in validators automatically, but you can create your own custom validators. Again, you would just use the ng, you use the CLI to create that, and there's basically an interface that has to be defined, and then you can go to town doing any type of validation that you want for a specific control to then use to validate a form. All right, animations. So if we switch back over here real quick. So if I click on this button, you can see that there's a ripple on it. So again, that was nothing that I did. It was something that Material did for me, which is nice, but they are just using the, again, it's all built on top of Angular Material is just built on top of Angular itself. So the animation piece is using standard animation. So those are the types of things that you could do to make your website more interactive for the user.
I've got a question. Is it possible to switch out of dark mode into a white background? Input that says that might be a little easier to read.
Yeah, so I did try that last night. There is a setting. So again, there is a setting over here in workspace settings. There is a VS Lite, but it's not. It doesn't turn into VS Lite. I do apologize for that. If you can't see it well, maybe when you get the YouTube, you'll be able to see it better. That is a downside on this, but that definitely would be a big plus to have. All right, so anything else, Justin?
Nope, that was it. Could you zoom in a little bit on the words?
Yes,
Maybe that would.
Definitely. All right. So Angular has this concept of pipes, which if you've been doing much computer work, I'm sure you know what a pipe is. It's just a vertical bar. You can basically attach a pipe to different inputs, and it will make modifications to those inputs. So a couple of pipes that you definitely will use. One is an async pipe. The JSON pipe you may not use so much as far as actually on your production site, but it is super useful in debugging your code. So with the JSON pipe, if you had say you were dealing with this form and you really wasn't sure what was going on, you could do form/pipe JSON, and you could see what that looks like. The async pipe would be for any observables. So remember I talked about RxJS, which is that in itself is a huge topic itself. But you can subscribe, instead of doing the subscribing and unsubscribing manually for you inside of your own code, you can just do an async pipe, and the async pipe itself takes care of the subscription and unsubscribing to as you enter and leave that page. Services. So services, this would be most services are singletons, meaning that there's only one instance of that service for the entire application, but it does not have to be that way. So a service needs a service provider. And basically the way a service provider works is when you inject a service into a component, the entire markup is, if you think of it as a tree structure, with your app being at the top of the tree like the Christmas tree star, and then everything else is underneath that in some fashion. When you go to inject the service, it will just start traversing that tree upwards until it can find a service provider. As soon as it finds a service provider for that service, it will use that instance. So you can end up with multiple instances of a service if you need that. It's just a matter of putting that service provider in the right location to give you that ability. Angular does provide dependency injection, which is also a nice feature. However, with dependency injection, you can become coupled. So the other thing that you can do to help decouple yourself is using a resolver. I will get into resolvers in a little bit later in the presentation. So just real quick, we had, if you recall, I click here, and as I click, I have a counter down here that's increasing. So an example of a pipe would be, what if I just said pipe %, and now my number is being transformed from a numerical value into a percentage value. And so as I can click, it just goes up in %. So, and then another thing that we can do real quick here. So again, let's say I wasn't sure about how this thing was really working. I thought, hey, something doesn't seem right. I could do team pipe JSON. And now you can see, oh, okay, it becomes ugly, okay, but it's a very useful debugging tool. You can see, okay, for this team name here, which is Ferrari, here's all the information about that team. It had 2 properties, name and color, Ferrari. Oh, and that does match, so that is right. So, right. All right, so moving on to HTTP client. So this will be a service that's provided by Angular. It's what you should be using to interact with any outside services. The key piece to note here is that every call, so it supports everything: get, put, post, patch, delete. All of those are calls, and they look like function calls, and they are function calls. However, if you look at the definition of it, the function itself is returning an observable. And why is this important? The reason it's important is because it's returning an observable. They're hot and cold observables. By default, this is a cold observable, meaning it will not return anything to you. So you can make a call to it and say, hey, go fetch this from the server. And unless somebody physically subscribes to that, it will not go and get that information. So you got to do the subscribe, which then makes it into a hot observable. But another downfall on all these observables is, let's say you had one component, and let's say you had a service that was giving you values about your user, and you had one component that maybe was displaying their avatar, and then let's say you had another component that was displaying their user information. And so the two components, they both need user information, and it all came from the same service call. Well, if you lay both of those components down and you subscribe to that, you could potentially be hitting that service twice to get the same information. And you can see as you load that up, it multiplies up, and it could be very taxing on your server. So the reason I wanted to point that out was just to be aware that it could, just because it's an observable, it is a good thing, but you do have to be careful on how you use them. And I wanted to point out that there's this thing called multicast/share. Both of those are different RxJS operators. And basically by doing multicast or share, it will only hit the server one time while there's an existing subscription available. It will only hit that service one time, so it will prevent having all those additional calls to the server. The other piece that I want to point out is there's this concept of HTTP interceptors, and those are very important. It enables you to intercept all the HTTP calls and do special things to it. And the special things is whatever you need it to do. But one example of that would be, let's say you need some security headers on your calls. So instead of going around and telling every little call, hey, add the security header, you can code up this HTTP interceptor, which is basically another service, and it will just sit there and look for every call. And then based off of your parameters, you can say, hey, interrogate this URL, and does this URL need these security headers? If so, insert those headers before letting it proceed down the pipe. The other useful thing for interceptor is like a busy indicator, meaning like, hey, I've got some network traffic and I'm waiting for a server response. So you could put some type of a spinner to indicate that to your user. You could just use an interceptor to recognize, hey, every time that somebody makes a call, you'll get a begin and end event, and you could basically keep a reference count to how many network calls there are and flip that busy bit from 0 to 1 so that the spinner shows and hides appropriately. So that was a lot of topics right there. Is there any questions about any of those?
Nothing specific about that yet. We have actually one question back in the code. It says you have ng container. Could you kind of expand upon that tag a little bit, when you would use that, that kind of stuff?
Oh, most definitely. So let me just get the code back up. All right, so here's ng container, and I'm glad that somebody asked this question. So ng container is nothing more, think of it like a div tag that you can put stuff inside. So like this doesn't show anything, but I just threw this up for demonstration purposes as we were talking to get this to repeat. But down here, I do have ng container, and it actually has stuff inside of it. Not only does it have stuff inside of it, it also has two ng containers. So why am I using those? So ng container itself is nothing more than markup for Angular itself. They do not get rendered. So Angular in the background, when it loads this page, it says, okay, there's an ng container, so I need to do something, and what do I need to render? And ultimately, because this best racing is currently on MotoGP, it just says, oh, I need to put MotoGP in here, and that is it. This ng container, if you look at the code behind here, or the markup behind here, you will not see these ng containers. Hopefully that was clear. All right. So I do want to stress that I have built several sites from the ground up, building it with nothing but Angular supplied technology, meaning no external packages. That's not to say you can't use external packages. I just want to stress that one of the good things about Angular, it is a framework within itself that you can pretty much build an entire website with no other outside packages. Now, you may run into an instance where you need something, and it may be, well, yeah, you can do it, but somebody else has done it, so you might as well reuse somebody else's stuff. But between Material and Angular, I pretty much can do everything that I need to do. The reason I point all that out, I'm going to say, just like everything, there is always the exception. There is one package that I do end up reusing, and that's this external package for OAuth 2. There's a link there. It's out on GitHub, but it does allow you to basically wire up your SPA app to use OAuth 2. I won't go into the details there. I'll just point out that it is a very useful external package. So modules is another piece that Angular has. Think of modules as just wrapping up things that could be reused. So each, if you think about an area, so one place that I end up using modules is for different areas of the app. So let's say I had an admin area, I might make a module for all the admin stuff. And then say you had a user area, so I might make a module for all the user stuff. But it's nothing more than it's an internal package for yourself, but it's the equivalent of having an external package. Okay, routing is a big subject, but I do have a different stack blitz for that. I did want to just show a few things real quick. And we'll talk about these items here real quick. There's normal routing, but then there's also nested routing. You could have named routers, meaning, so what do I mean by normal and nested? So you could have a page with just a router outlet at the top level, and that's the only router outlet in your entire application. And so if you navigate to A/B/C is still rendered in that single router outlet. It can be done, it's just not as elegant. So what about if you go to A and then every path underneath A, you had another router outlet? So the way you would do that is you'd have two router outlets, one in each component. And so then that becomes the nested piece of that. Then you can, lastly, you can have on a single page, you can have multiple router outlets, but to end up being able to utilize multiple router outlets, one of them at least has to be named, and then you have to tell it, hey, I want this component to go here. I'm on a route to this, and I want it to go here on the page. There are a couple of functions that are super useful while you're doing routing. One is called can activate, and one's called can deactivate. So can activate would be very useful for, hey, you want to put security around a page and you want to prevent people from getting there if they're not authorized. So you can do some checks and say, hey, if they're not an admin, don't allow them on that page. Can deactivate would be similar opposite. So let's say this was a form and I was clicking submit, but maybe I don't want to allow them to navigate until I get a successful submission. So even if there was routing on this, it would be looking to say, hey, has it been successful? If it hasn't been successful, it wouldn't let them actually leave this page. Resolve. So we've all seen pages where you got different stuff, and it's got to go to the server, load it up, and it takes a bit, and you can see all the components kind of populating as it's happening. Resolve kind of, and then the other piece that you see is, hey, I got to go get this stuff from the server, but the server wasn't actually able to serve it up for some reason. It didn't exist, or whatever the case, it had some error. So resolve by itself will prevent both of those things. So resolve basically means before you actually navigate to that route, I need this information resolved. So go get the information however you need, and once I have all the information, then I'll continue my routing and go to that page. And again, let's say you had an error, then you could, instead of routing to that page and showing some ugly markup, you could actually just post a message right there saying, hey, this error occurred while doing that. Lastly, lazy loading. So each route can be lazy loaded. The piece about that is it becomes nice from a speed perspective from, hey, as I load the app initially, I don't have to get the entire app from the server. I can just grab the bits that I need to get started. And as I move around, I just naturally grab more and more information from the server. Are there any questions about that?
We got a good question here. We got about 3 minutes left. But this question says, let's say I am a business needing an application to be built. What makes me feel confident in the choice of Angular versus React, Python, or any of the other languages that exist? As an SME, I would love to hear your thoughts.
So I wouldn't say that, so some of it just ends up being preferences. I wouldn't say that Angular is better. So in my personal opinion, I definitely like Angular better than the other frameworks. But the reason I like Angular better has to do with it's a complete framework. So like I said, with these tools that I've shown you today, I can build a complete site. I don't have to go and get any other external applications to plug in. I don't have to figure out their methodology. I don't have to figure out their syntax. I can just immediately get hit in the ground and running type deal. So for me, Angular is a much better platform. But having said that, it is, because it's a complete framework, there is a lot of information, as you can see through the presentation. So it does have a steep learning curve. It is steeper than some of those other frameworks that were asked about. But again, it's when you say, hey, it's the framework itself can't do as much. Well, is it really steeper because now I have to go and learn these other things that I may or may not reuse? All right, so that was question one. What's the other one?
Well, the other one says, I really like your idea of using an interceptor to track network activity. Do you have a public example of that somewhere?
I do not have a public example, but I could put something together. So my email is chrisglass@improving.com. If you send me an email, I will help you out. What else, Justin?
That is all. We are about at time.
Yep. So real quick, last slide, moving on to actually a different topic, just real quick. It's called NativeScript. So NativeScript is actually something that will allow you to build a mobile application using Angular technology. When I say mobile application, it is a truly native mobile app, meaning it's not interpreted and it's not a web window. So I just wanted to point that out. It is cool technology. If you're interested, you should go check it out. The other cool thing about that real quick is you can create a sample app real quick within minutes. You can download a sample app from NativeScript itself, and you can make modifications on your laptop, and they show up on your mobile device instantly. All right. So we had questions. Thanks for attending. These are the 2 stack blitzes that I had. They will be with the YouTube. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope I was able to help people out. Thank you.